Welcome to Stream of Conscience, brought to you by Democracy for America, Fairfield County. I'm your host, John Hartwell. Our guest today is State Representative Matt Lesser, who represents Middletown, Middlefield, and Durham. Matt was the youngest state rep when he was first elected in 2008, and he's the vice chair of the Government Affairs and Elections Committee. In that position, he works on ethics, public financing, contracting for the state, elections, and the state constitution. Shortly after being elected, Matt began receiving emails, newsletters, newspapers, books from a group called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Having no idea who this group was, Matt began to research them. He's here today to tell us what he found. Matt, welcome to Stream of Conscience.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here.
So ALEC, A-L-E-C, sounds benign, you know, our best friend ALEC. What's it all about?
Well, that was a question that I had when I was first sworn in January of 2009. I started receiving, as you mentioned, books in the mail, emails, etc., newspapers, newsletters from this organization that I never heard of, and from different groups that were associated with it on all sorts of issues, from energy policy to the environment to opposition to President Obama's health care reforms, you name it, on the issues. There were materials on that subject. So I looked into this organization, found it is a 501c3 charity. That is a national organization where 2,000 different legislators get together, funded by tax-deductible contributions from major corporations. And they get together and they orchestrate plans, they share model legislation, they advocate for particular policy solutions, and they do an incredibly effective job of disseminating the perspective of their funders and the perspective of the particular conservative wing of the Republican Party to state legislatures around the country.
So now, a 501c3, normally we think of them as being a foundation, like the Red Cross,
exactly,
or some other group out there that's doing good for the public. And when you give money to a foundation, then you as an individual get to take a deduction from your taxable income, and so the government, in fact, is supporting the organization in some way. And this is churches and foundations and all kinds of charitable institutions around the country. This is how they manage their businesses and make their money, make the money that they need in order to take care of themselves. What's wrong with a group like ALEC being a foundation and thereby indirectly subsidized by both the federal government and by state government?
Well, very, very simple. It was because they're not a charity. And there are lots of charities out there. You know what a charity is. Everybody knows them. Everybody donates to them. This is a political organization that works to advance a particular political agenda that is an extreme agenda. They are lobbying for that agenda, and they are accepting unlimited campaign contributions from corporations to advance that agenda. This is a political organization. It is not a charity, and they don't do charitable work. It's plainly obvious. And there's nothing I have against a corporation or conservative folks, members of the Tea Party, working together to advance their political agenda. That is fine. This is democracy. That's America. But it does seem a little strange that taxpayers should be subsidizing them in the form of giving them tax-exempt status. And it does seem unusual that the folks who are retirees, who have their savings invested in stocks of corporations or in mutual funds, should see their money, their pension funds, be used to fund efforts to eliminate their pensions. And that's something you see because you see these anti-union efforts all around the country that are organized, orchestrated through ALEC, and they are being funded by the same folks who are receiving the pensions. And that seems a little strange.
Who are some of the major funders of ALEC?
Well, you could look at they have a corporate board of directors. They've got two different boards of directors. Their standard board is of elected officials, includes a state representative in Connecticut, as well as folks from around the country. And then they also have a corporate board. Corporations give money to ALEC. They're then able to sit on task forces, vote in task forces on model legislation that's then handed out to the country. And you go down the list, and it's a who's who of American big business. The current chairman of the corporate board is a lobbyist from Greenwich named Preston Baldwin, who does a lot of work for tobacco companies. And you see tobacco companies as major funders. You also see PhRMA, the organization of pharmaceutical companies. You see the insurance industry.
Which is a big business here in Connecticut.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of Connecticut ties to this. You see insurance companies, ExxonMobil, Coca-Cola, blue chip companies, American companies are the Koch Industries, which has gotten a lot of attention recently.
The Koch brothers.
Exactly,
Right.
for their support of conservative causes.
Right.
But it's really a who's who list. There are over 300 corporate members of ALEC, a who's who of American industry, and they are doing what they see is in their interests and advancing the interests of their shareholders.
And do we have any idea what the budget of ALEC is?
You know, I don't actually know that. It's in the millions of dollars, though.
I'm sure it's in the many millions of dollars. So what sort of interests are they proposing? What kind of legislation do they circulate around the country?
Well, the example that I think has gotten the most attention is Arizona's SB 1070, the anti-immigration law that was passed last year. That
was an ALEC initiative.
That was a result of model legislation drafted by ALEC, and that's legislation that was introduced obviously in Arizona, but also in Florida and now many other states. And the particular issue that seemed to attract the most controversy from ALEC's standpoint, as opposed to the particular policy details, is that that was drawn up by a task force that had among its members a private prison company called the Corrections Corporation of America.
Right.
And so it seemed to suggest, and obviously we don't know what was happening because this was behind closed doors. There were no members of the public there. But it seemed to suggest that there might be a situation where a private prison corporation was lobbying for a law which would have the result of increasing the number of prisoners in the state of Arizona. And that would seem to be deeply troubling for those of us who believe in democracy, who believe in open government. And it's just a bizarre and crazy situation when you could have a company that is operating prisons lobbying to put more people behind bars.
So that might be analogous perhaps to a defense contractor promoting us for going to war.
Exactly, the same situation, and you don't want to have that happening in our democracy.
No, but we know that it happens all the time. So ALEC has corporate members and it has state legislators. And the state legislators, were you offered to join ALEC? Were you allowed?
Oh, absolutely. They are overwhelmingly Republican and conservative Republicans, but they also welcome. There are Democratic members. A few, I think there are something like 7 Democrats who are members of ALEC. But yeah,
nationwide.
I think so. Nationwide, I don't believe there are any
7
in Connecticut. Yeah, and I believe there's something like 2,000 legislators who are members.
2,000 to 7.
We're not talking about it. It's
not balanced.
It's not balanced, and it doesn't pretend to be. It's a conservative Republican organization that is purportedly part of the conservative movement, but they've really, I feel, and I'm concerned, may have been co-opted by the interests of these private corporations that fund them. And to answer your question, yes, I was invited. Every legislator received an email invitation to join. And it's enticing, particularly if you share those views, because in Connecticut, for as many states, we have a part-time legislature. We are not paid very much, and ALEC gives legislators a free paid trip to their conference site, gives their families a free trip as well, puts them up, treats them well, at the events, while ALEC won't give them money, they can certainly do a lot of networking, do fundraising for your re-election campaign. And so for somebody in Connecticut, we get paid $28,000 a year to be given a free, all expense paid trip around the country. Is certainly enticing, and so there are a lot of people.
I'm sorry, is that available? That free trip, is that available to each and every member, legislative member of ALEC?
Yes, it is, and I think there are some questions about whether or not that violates Connecticut's election laws, whether or not you can accept ethics laws, whether or not you can accept that. But that is the offer around the country: is a free trip to participate in ALEC.
And again, where do they have these conferences?
I think the most recent one was in Cincinnati, but it goes around the country. They do a different one every year, and then there are other conferences as well.
And it's all expense paid.
All expense paid.
So it's not a bad deal wherever it is.
No, absolutely not. And one of the things that I was puzzled by, I have been a strong proponent of laws to strengthen privacy protections for people's credit scores, for people's credit histories.
Yeah.
I was finding that there were constituents of mine who were applying for jobs, and in most cases now, employers are asking to see your credit score, your credit history before they employ you. Yes. And that raised privacy concerns for me, as well as questions about the amount of oversight we were providing over these credit rating agencies. And in recent years, Reed Elsevier, which is the parent company of, among other things, LexisNexis, but also the largest credit reporting background screening agency in the country, has joined ALEC, has contributed large amounts of money to ALEC, and is now supporting efforts through ALEC to protect the background screening firms around the country. And so that's an example that affected me, not because I was directly affected by this, because I was the proponent of legislation in Connecticut, which we actually finally got passed this year, to limit its activities.
So basically, you came up directly against
in their crosshairs, yeah.
In their crosshairs. And how did you feel that? I mean, what did you see that as? Did you see specific legislators coming up to you and trying to get you to move your position one way or another? Did you have lobbyists talking?
Sure.
Did you have constituents talking to you? Did you get mail from ALEC or phone calls from ALEC? And what happened?
It's hard to say, and to be honest, I don't think they were so concerned about me. I think they were concerned about solidifying the Republican Party in Connecticut, and more importantly in other states, against this legislation, because I think they're not trying to persuade Democrats on this stuff. They are really trying to solidify their base and get their particular viewpoints adopted by Tea Party and movement conservatives who would otherwise be, I think, inclined to support some of the same populist legislation that many of us in the Democratic Party would. But I think I see this as a co-opting of their movement.
And how many state legislators in Connecticut belong to ALEC? I
think it's something like 22. It may be more than that, but I believe it's about 22. There are 2 members of the legislature, Representative Hovey from the Newtown area and Senator Witkos, who are heads of the Connecticut ALEC organization. And then there's a separate organization, state chapter, yes.
A state chapter.
And then in addition to that, Representative John Piscopo is again from this area of the state, is a national vice chairman of the organization. So he helps to oversee it. And so there is an involvement in Connecticut, and obviously their chairman, President Baldwin, lives in Greenwich. So there are a lot of corporate interests in this state who are deeply involved in ALEC.
And what other sorts of legislation have you seen them push in Hartford?
Well, in Hartford, it's hard to say because Republicans don't control either of the branches of government.
Right.
We have a Democratic governor. I know that nationally they have been deeply involved in, again, as I mentioned, anti-union efforts, efforts against climate change. We saw some unusual national efforts to promote nullification, for example, of the federal health insurance reforms. Very conservative positions that you normally saw in pre-civil rights southern states, and you don't normally see coming up to Connecticut. And so those were some efforts that we saw in Connecticut. We saw a press conference there, and hard to say what was ALEC inspired and what wasn't. But certainly around the country, they have been shopping around model legislation, which a legislator is free to introduce, and they will do everything in their power to support the introduction of that legislation.
It's very interesting. Is there any group like this on the left?
The answer is no. There are Democratic groups, progressive groups. In New York, there is an organization called the Progressive States Network, for example, and they certainly draft model legislation, which they do their best to disseminate. But what you don't have is the funding that ALEC brings, the staff, the resources. They don't have national conferences, they don't fly people out, and they aren't able to get legislators in touch with corporate backers who can get this stuff accomplished. So in terms of anybody can sit with a computer and draft model legislation, but coming up with a mechanism to actually get it through legislative bodies is something that the left hasn't done, right. Hasn't had much success in doing. And I think that to some extent is a function of disorganization on the part of the left, and partly because they don't have the support from corporate America that ALEC has received.
So it's another area of American politics where money is becoming a huge, huge factor. And we've seen that, of course, with Citizens United. Mm-hmm. And I was having a conversation just yesterday with someone saying, look, it doesn't matter what the limitations are on personal giving to federal campaigns. Yeah. It doesn't matter anymore because you can give all the money you want to a super PAC and they can go do whatever they want. And
absolutely. And one of the things that I did encounter this year, we had a bill to pass legislation called National Popular Vote.
Yes.
And this was a response. It started, I think, shortly after the Bush v. Gore election and decision in 2000, with folks concerned that the U.S. Electoral College was not responsive and in certain cases could be undemocratic. And so we had a bill this year, and we've seen it before, to try to make a new system based on the electoral vote, and it's a compact between the states. And ALEC did lead a charge against it. And again, focusing on solidifying Republican opposition to the measure as a way of coming up with a backstop. Because the last time we considered it in 2009, a lot of Republicans had supported it, and so this is a bit of a it's something, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. I think most people agree that Connecticut gets ignored during presidential elections, and that bringing presidential candidates here by being part of a national movement helps increase our voice. And that was something that a lot of Republicans were agreeing on in this state, and I think that consensus has sort of fallen by the wayside. And I don't know if you can't attribute it directly to ALEC, but it's at the same time that ALEC has taken up a stronger voice in opposing it.
So you sit on the Government Affairs Committee, and the Clean Elections Act came through that committee. There's been money taken away from it in order to help balance the budget. There are people who are concerned that it's going to be underfunded when we come up to the next election cycle. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I was part of the first class of legislators who was elected under the clean election system, the public financing system we have in Connecticut. It was in 2008, and I was able, using that program, to defeat an entrenched three-term incumbent. In his previous election, he'd been able to outfund his opponent 5-1. And so this put us on an even keel, and it let us both get our viewpoints out, our stance on the issues out equally. And I think that's the fairest way of doing things. So yes, we do have a lot of work to do. We're in a very difficult fiscal environment. We have to make a lot of tough choices. But I think it's ultimately in taxpayers' interest to protect the public financing program, because if you think it's expensive, look at the alternative when, unfortunately, elected officials are listening to the people who are giving them campaign contributions.
And I think a big issue coming up in Hartford this year is the redistricting. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's a very even committee, same number of Republicans as Democrats, 4 and 4, 2 from each for the House and the Senate. Where do you think that's going to come out? Are we going to see major changes in the way the House and the State Senate are redistricted? I
don't think so. We have a committee that's actually looking at the issue right now. They're supposed to come out with a report in the next couple of weeks that can get 2/3 of the support of both parties in the legislature. If that doesn't happen, then it goes to a commission, and if that doesn't happen, it goes to a court. But Connecticut isn't losing any seats. It's not gaining any seats. My guess, and this is just a guess because I'm not on the committee, is that it will probably be resolved in the next month or two, and that there won't be too many major changes to any of the districts.
Well, Matt, thanks very much for coming in today. It's fascinating to hear about ALEC, and a lot of us have really not heard of this organization before, so it's something we need to pay attention to in the future and figure out what's going on.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, a stream of conscience commentary from Tom Hedberg.
I was among the first responders at the World Trade Center on the 11th of September, 2001. The nightmare we lived through that day is something most Americans are now thoroughly familiar with. This year, when we observed the 10th anniversary of the event, we remembered our heroes, mourned our dead, steeled our resolve to never see it happen again, and once more forgot to remember one of the major casualties of the attack. 10 years ago, shortly before we left the triage unit and after we watched Bush and Giuliani prance around on the ruins inciting war, several of us were interviewed by mainstream media. Those who raised questions of why, rather than instantly calling for blood and payback, were either redirected to a different approach or cut off mid-sentence. Over the next weeks and months, that didn't change. It looked like public response to 9/11 was in the process of being programmed, and that deviations from that program, especially concerns about too much war with too little strategic understanding of anti-Americanism, we're just not going to get much tolerance or airtime. The U.S. at large was given limited time to think before it was urged to kill. Now granted, when a nation is going to war, opinion is molded to unify the population behind the effort. This is fine when the individual citizen still counts. However, the 21st is not the century of the common man, and there is little tolerance for the messy inefficiency of dealing with individuals. During the next few years, politicians and mainstream media made sure we knew who to hate and why. Directives which evolved rapidly to bear the corollary that questioning authority, especially where security was concerned, was dangerous and unpatriotic. Now, was all this necessary? It depends on what you value. While internal security is a critical function of government and protects a threatened people, it is possible to conduct it in a civilized manner. For example, when done intelligently, it prevents 20-minute airport shakedowns of elderly grandmothers found carrying nail files. But when run poorly, it allows bomb-laden madmen like Mr. Abdul Muttalib onto Flight 253 and legislates things like the Patriot Act. After 2003, as constitutional safeguards became somewhat porous, personal judgment and individual integrity devolved into quaint concepts. At airports, then office buildings, and finally in malls, it seemed safest to just line up, shut up, and do as you were told. The question is, when is enough enough? A decade after the onset of permanent high-tech war, the justification of almost anything on the grounds of security has morphed into something rather worrisome. No small concern, since America has never lacked those eager to participate in legalized intolerance. Last week, security guards in the Mall of America detained a man carrying a camcorder. After dismissing protests over his rough treatment, he was told, "We can either do this the easy way or the hard way." A few days later, a 71-year-old was wrestled to the ground, handcuffed, and arrested by Wisconsin police for criticizing Republican Paul Ryan during a town meeting. Ryan later joked at the man's expense. No one spoke up. You don't question cops nowadays. Since 9/11, persons in positions of even minor authority who deal with the public increasingly conclude they have a green light for arrogance and disrespect. In a nation reluctant to question authority, ticket takers issue demands, Metro-North conductors bark orders, and cops conduct high-speed chases through busy streets or break into homes looking for drugs or suspects with guns blazing, and it goes without saying that all are innocent of any wrongdoing. Within a decade of 9/11, a fiercely individualistic nation whose young soldiers are dying to preserve liberty, freedom, and the rights of the common man has learned to meekly submit to being manhandled by mall security guards over trivialities. Dangerously, those who cannot be cops or authority figures, but are envious of the power they now wield, resort to being bullies or police impersonators. And some just pick up an assault rifle and blow away the consumers at the local IHOP. Down in hell, Osama bin Laden must be grinning ear to ear. Accepting this transformation of the American psyche allows civil decency and the historic value of our citizenship to just slip away. It becomes as easy to watch a report of official brutality as to thumb-diddle ourselves into an alternate universe with our iPods and BlackBerries. The commemorations of 9/11 should unite Americans in celebrating their rights and freedoms. Replaying the tried-and-true drama of self-pity without the leavening of respect only preserves how dangerous we can be to ourselves. This has been a Stream of Conscience commentary. I'm Tom Hedberg. Thanks for watching.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. If you live in the town served by Cablevision from Norwalk, you can catch our show every Wednesday on Channel 88. If you're interested in learning more about progressive political action in Fairfield County, please check out our Democracy for America group. We meet the first Wednesday of the month, 7 to 9 p.m. at the Silver Star Diner in Norwalk. We always welcome new members. Remember, change is possible, and you can make it happen. This has been Stream of Conscience, and I'm your host, John Hartwell. We hope to see you again soon.